In a small village nestled between two towering mountains, life was simple and peaceful. Children played by the riverbanks, and farmers tilled their land, harvesting enough to provide for their families. The air was filled with the scent of pine trees and the sound of birds singing. But that peace was fragile, and the distant echo of war grew closer with every passing day. One morning, the villagers awoke to the sight of soldiers marching through the valley. They wore armor that glistened in the sunlight, and their faces were hard, etched with the weight of battle. Rumors had spread of a great war between the kingdoms to the north and south, but the village had always been untouched until now. As the soldiers passed, they left a message with the village elder: "Prepare yourselves, the war is coming and you must choose a side." The villagers who had lived in harmony for generations were divided. Some argued that they should fight for the kingdom of the north, while others believed the south had more to offer. Fear and uncertainty spread like wildfire. In the midst of this tension was a young man named Elias. He had grown up in the village, learning the ways of the forest from his father, a skilled hunter. Elias despised the thought of war. He had seen what violence could do. His mother had died in a raid years ago, and the memory of her loss still haunted him. But he also knew that if the village did nothing, it would be destroyed. One evening, Elias gathered the villagers around a fire. "We cannot let this war tear us apart," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "We are stronger together, and we do not need to take sides. We can defend our home without losing who we are." His words resonated with many, but not all. Some still left to join the armies, hoping to protect their families by fighting for one kingdom or another. But Elias and those who stayed began preparing for the worst. They built fortifications around the village, stockpiled food, and trained to defend themselves, not for conquest, but for survival. The war came as they knew it would. One cold morning, the sound of drums echoed through the valley, and the armies of both kingdoms clashed on the fields just outside the village. For hours, the villagers heard the distant roar of battle, the clang of swords, and the cries of the wounded, but they stayed hidden, protecting their homes and each other. As the sun set, the armies withdrew, leaving behind a battlefield strewn with the dead and dying. The village had been spared, but the cost of war was all too clear. Elias and the other villagers ventured out to tend to the wounded, regardless of which side they had fought for. They knew that in the end they were all the same, people trying to survive in a world torn apart by conflict. The war continued for years, but the village remained neutral, a small island of peace in a sea of chaos. Elias, now older and wiser, led his people with compassion and strength. And though the scars of war never fully healed, the village endured, a testament to the power of unity and the hope that peace might one day return. In the shadow of war, they had found a way to live. As the years passed, the war between the northern and southern kingdoms began to wane. The armies grew weary, and the cost of endless fighting became too great for both sides to bear. The villages and cities across the land lay in ruins, and hunger gnawed at the hearts of those who had lost everything. But amidst the devastation, the small village in the valley stood as a beacon of resilience. Elias, now a respected leader, often walked the perimeter of the village, his thoughts heavy with the memories of battles fought and lives lost. The villagers had survived by refusing to be drawn into the conflict, but they had also suffered. Families were separated, and some who had left to join the armies never returned. One evening, as Elias sat near the old fire pit where he had once rallied his people, a messenger arrived. He wore the tattered colors of the northern kingdom, but there was no pride in his posture, only exhaustion. "The kings have agreed to meet for peace talks," the messenger said, his voice hoarse from the journey. "They wish to use your village as neutral ground." Elias was silent for a long moment. The village had remained untouched by the war because they had kept it out, but now peace itself was asking to come through their gates. He looked around at the faces of the villagers who had gathered to hear the news. Some were hopeful, others were afraid. They had lived in the shadow of war for so long, they had almost forgotten what peace could look like. Finally, Elias spoke. "If our village can help end this war, then we will do so. But let it be known that no weapons will enter our gates. If the kings wish to speak of peace, they will do so with words alone." The decision was met with murmurs of agreement, though fear lingered in the hearts of many. Preparations were made to welcome the envoys from both kingdoms, and soon the once quiet village was filled with the bustle of people repairing roads, cleaning the square, and preparing food for the guests. But underneath the activity was an unspoken tension. Could peace truly be forged, or would this be just another battle in disguise? The day finally arrived. The kings of the north and south entered the village, each with a small retinue, their faces lined with the toll of years of fighting. Elias greeted them at the gates, standing tall but with no show of force. "Welcome," he said, "to a place that has seen enough of war." The negotiations began, and for days the kings argued, accused, and blamed one another for the horrors of the past. But each night they returned to their simple lodgings in the village, where the silence of the mountains seemed to soften their anger. Slowly, the talk shifted from accusations to concessions, from demands to compromise. Elias watched from a distance, his hope guarded but growing. The villagers continued their work, feeding the envoys, providing shelter, and watching as the fate of their world hung in the balance. They knew that, like their village, peace would require patience, understanding, and sacrifice. After weeks of negotiations, a treaty was finally signed. The war that had ravaged the land for so long would end. The kings, though weary, left the village with a promise to rebuild what had been destroyed. As they departed, Elias stood at the gate, watching them go, the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. The village, once caught in the shadow of war, had become the birthplace of peace. And though the scars of conflict remained, both on the land and in the hearts of the people, they knew that a new chapter had begun, one where unity and hope could flourish once more. Elias, now an elder in the truest sense, continued to lead his people with wisdom and compassion. He knew that peace was fragile, like a flame flickering in the wind, but he also knew that as long as they stood together, they could protect it, nurture it, and pass it on to future generations. And so, in the valley between the mountains, the village lived on, a place where the memory of war would never be forgotten, but where the promise of peace would forever endure.